Contractor Ryan Falk would never have expected an ordinary workday to end with a police operation. He had come to demolish an old shed on the outskirts of St. Bridget Cemetery in the small town of Port Olna, Louisiana, and could not even imagine that inside, a discovery awaited him that would make this place the center of a sensational investigation. As Ryan approached, he examined the door with the rusted lock and quickly broke it open. Immediately, a pungent, suffocating smell was perceptible. A strange mixture of dampness, decay, and an intrusive lavender aroma. He decided not to go inside, which turned out to be the right decision, and called 911. A few minutes later, Officer Cal Broussard arrived. After listening to the contractor, he switched on his flashlight and entered the dark shed. The beam of light glided over the walls and immediately snagged on several stacks of wooden coffins, neatly piled one on top of the other. There were 12 in total. One, numbered 7, stood out particularly. It was leaning crookedly against the wall, and its lower part was rotted from moisture. Broussard stepped closer and shone his light into a gap in the coffin. At the sight, he instinctively recoiled. A desiccated human hand clearly protruded from the rotted wood, covered with a layer of mold and dirt. From that moment on, the abandoned shed on the edge of the cemetery was no longer just a dilapidated building, but the beginning of an investigation that would uncover the shocking secrets of the small town of Port Olne. The investigators began the inquiry with the simplest and most obvious step, finding out exactly who owned the shed with the 12 forgotten coffins found on the edge of the cemetery. They requested information from the Municipal Land Registry and effortlessly received the desired answer. The property, along with the old brick shed, belonged to the Giroux family, the same family that had run the only funeral home in Port Olne for decades. This establishment had already closed in the mid-90s, after which the Giroux practically disappeared from town life and were forgotten by most locals. At the time of the discovery, the only living representative of the Giroux family was 84-year-old Mathilda, the widow of funeral home owner Alain Giraud. Few in the town knew of her existence, mainly older people who had witnessed the times when the establishment was active and in demand. For the younger generation, the name Giraud meant nothing. The investigators decided to meet with Mathilda personally to try and find out any details about the shed and its strange contents. They drove to her house, an old one-story building on the town's main street, very close to where the funeral home had once been located. The house seemed modest but very well maintained. It was obvious that it was carefully looked after. A small garden in front of the entrance, clean curtains on the windows, no signs of neglect often seen in elderly people living alone. Mathilda herself opened the door to the investigators and calmly invited them in. The house was quiet and felt slightly empty. The rooms contained very simple, old furniture, and on the walls hung photographs of her deceased husband, Alain, as well as small religious icons. By all appearances, the mistress of the house led a very modest, almost reclusive lifestyle, but at the same time carefully maintained order and cleanliness around her. However, as soon as the investigators entered the house, they noticed a strange but familiar smell. The house was permeated with lavender, fresh and pleasant, but distinctly similar to that heavy and suffocating smell they had previously perceived in the old shed on the cemetery's edge. This moment made the detectives take notice, although it remained unclear until the very end whether this could be a simple coincidence or if there was more to it. When the conversation turned to the found coffins and the shed on the cemetery grounds, Mathilda surprised the investigators with her reaction. The woman showed absolutely no emotion. She appeared neither frightened nor troubled, as if she had long expected such a conversation. Instead of denying her involvement or showing surprise, Mathilda calmly stated that all of this was directly related to her deceased husband, Alain. According to her, she had known for a long time that the day would come when someone from the town would discover what her husband had hidden. She implied that she felt obliged to keep this secret, and only now, after so many years, was the story gradually coming to light. This reaction, simultaneously calm and resigned, truly surprised the detectives. Matilda did not seem like a criminal. She had no obvious reasons to hide anything. On the contrary, her lifestyle and behavior suggested a complete inability to commit serious acts. Townspeople described her exclusively as a quiet, deeply religious woman who lived modestly and poorly, often relying on the help of neighbors and community members of the local church. However, her words prompted the investigators to look at the case from a different angle. Matilda obviously knew far more about her husband's sins than she could or would openly admit. Now, the task was to find out exactly what had gone on at the Giraud family funeral home when it was still in operation, and what actions of Alain's might have led to 12 forgotten coffins being hidden in the old brick shed in the cemetery. For this, the detectives had to go back to the Giraud family's past and carefully study the archives and documents of the establishment from the years when its doors were open to the residents of Port-Aulne. After the conversation with Mathilde Giraud, the investigators returned to the shed at Saint-Bridget Cemetery. Now, a team of forensic technicians and the local medical examiner were working on site, tasked with determining what was inside each of the 12 coffins. The shed was cordoned off to prevent unauthorized access, and the experts began to methodically examine the entire contents. At this moment, no one yet realized the full extent of the situation and how far this investigation could lead. The medical examiner and experts began by opening the coffins, which had previously been numbered from 1 to 12. The coffins, made of simple pine wood, had been severely affected by moisture and time, so they were opened carefully to avoid overlooking the smallest details that could aid the investigation. After the first coffins were opened, it quickly became apparent that the case was far more serious than the investigators had initially assumed. Human remains, which had been in the shed for decades, were discovered in each box. Their condition had significantly deteriorated due to prolonged exposure to moisture and constant flooding. The medical examiner noted that, due to the specific climate in the shed, the remains were partially mummified naturally. But even in this state, identifying the individuals seemed an almost impossible task. As the investigators opened the remaining coffins, they found that each of the 12 was filled with similar remains. This suggested that it was not an isolated incident, but a clearly organized system that had existed for a long time. According to an initial expert estimate, the remains could have been there for about 40 years, from the late 70s to the early 80s. And all that time, no one in the town suspected that something like this was hidden in the abandoned building on the edge of the cemetery. The long storage time significantly complicated the investigators' work. The longer the remains remained unidentified, the lower the chances of finding out who these people were when they were alive. Due to the shed's regular flooding, much of the evidence and potential clues had been lost. Now, these unidentified remains had become a kind of ghosts. People without a story, without names, and without a past that could be easily reconstructed. Already the next day, the police officially announced that the remains of 12 unknown individuals had been found in Port-Aulne. The news spread like wildfire in the town, causing unrest among residents. People began to recall old stories and missing person cases, trying to find out if the discovery could be connected to them, or if it was an entirely new mystery. Following the official initiation of a criminal case, the shed and its contents became the focal point of an investigation that promised to be lengthy and complicated. Now, investigators had to determine whether these remains were connected to a crime committed decades ago and carefully covered up, or if it was fraud, where someone simply collected money for burials without providing the actual services. The investigators were now faced with two main theories. Either the discovered remains were the result of a crime carefully concealed in the past, or the owners of the Giraud Institute had acted fraudulently, accepting money for burials without fulfilling their obligations to clients. Much depended on which version would be confirmed, and now the investigators were forced to meticulously analyze the town archives and old files of Port-Aulne residents to understand how and why 12 people had been hidden in the old brick shed. The investigators immediately began checking the main theory. Most likely, it was fraud. This theory seemed the most convincing and fit practically all the facts available at that time. To confirm or rule out this assumption, the detectives set about studying the old archives of the Giroux and Son Institute, as well as the parish registers of St. Bridget Church. Surprisingly, despite their age, the condition of the documents allowed them to obtain the necessary information without much difficulty, and the very first pages provided important clues for the investigation. While studying the church archives, the investigators noticed recurring payments that the church regularly transferred to Alain Giroux. These payments were made over a period of 9 years, beginning in 1979 and ending in 1988. In all records, the identical wording was found: cremation, unclaimed. In total, 12 such entries were counted, and each was clearly documented. The detectives compared these entries with the number of coffins previously found in the shed, and the match was exact. 12 payments. 12 found coffins. At first glance, everything looked logical and clear. Alain Giroux regularly received money from the church for the cremation of individuals no one was looking for or inquiring about. But instead of driving the remains to the crematorium in Baton Rouge, located 50 miles from town, he simply stored them in the shed next to the cemetery, only 1 mile from his institute. Such behavior was explained by mundane greed and the desire to cut costs. Alain saved both money and time, raising no suspicion in the process. This version received additional support after examining the list of individuals listed as unclaimed. It turned out that almost all of them were single elderly people, or simply random individuals without papers and relatives who were passing through Port Orne. None of the locals were interested in their fate, and the Giroux Institute actively exploited this. For them, these were simple assignments. No checks and no additional costs, just receiving money and minimal formalities with the church. However, the more the investigators studied the case files, the more details emerged that could not be explained by ordinary financial gain alone. Particularly strange was the lavender smell discernible in the shed. If Alain Giroux's goal was merely to conceal his fraud and avoid outside attention, why did he or someone else continue to care for the coffins, keep them meticulously clean, and spread a pleasant scent? This did not fit the usual logic of fraud at all and made the investigators ponder. To clarify this point, the detectives carefully re-examined the forensic technician's report. It noted an interesting detail. The coffins, the floor, and even the walls of the shed were covered with a thick layer of white powder. At first, the police thought it was simple dust or ordinary waste, but the laboratory analysis yielded a completely different result. The powder was ordinary cosmetic talcum powder with a lavender aroma, widely available in household goods stores. Following this discovery, the police searched Mathilde Giroux's house. Dozens of empty packages of exactly the same lavender talcum powder were found in the pantry and attic of the house. Moreover, some packages were relatively new, confirming regular use. Neighbors also reported that Mathilde often left the house in the morning with a small bag and returned after a few hours. Until then, everyone had thought she was going to pray or visit her husband's grave. But now it turned out that her daily walks ended at the shed in the cemetery. Such behavior by Mathilde was completely inexplicable from the perspective of simple fraud. If the shed was merely a storage place for Alain Giroux related to financial schemes, his wife obviously perceived this place differently. For years, Mathilde cared for the coffins, maintained order, and ensured a fresh scent, as if fulfilling a personal duty. This discovery fundamentally changed the understanding of the case. Behind the seemingly simple fraud, a far more complex picture emerged. Now it became obvious that the Giroux family's actions were not solely about money. For Alain, it was merely a financial advantage, but Mathilde clearly acted for other reasons. Her behavior pointed to a deep sense of guilt that compelled her to regularly visit the shed and care for what was there. The investigators now had to find out what past events had led Mathilde Giroux to maintain such strange care for people no one remembered for years. The The investigators decided to examine Mathilde Giroux's personality more closely, as her actions raised many questions and went far beyond a simple explanation. The detectives began to speak with local residents to learn more about Mathilde's everyday life. One of the first people they questioned was Father Michael, the pastor of the church Mathilde attended. He said that the woman had long had a reputation as an unusual churchgoer. People regarded her with a mixture of caution and pity, seeing her as a withdrawn person, absorbed in her own thoughts and prayers. Mathilde could stand motionless before the altar for hours, as if she had lost connection with the outside world, constantly muttering something softly to herself. Previously, no one had seen anything suspicious in this and dismissed it as a peculiarity of her age and character. But now, her oddities took on a completely different meaning. The investigators visited the small store where Mathilde did her shopping. The salesperson immediately recognized the woman and confirmed that she regularly bought lavender talcum powder, which the investigators already knew. But then he reported another, far more unusual purchase. Mathilde constantly bought small white socks, always in the same size and color. The salesperson had noted these strange purchases because he didn't understand why a solitary elderly woman who had practically no contact with other people regularly bought such items. This new information reminded the investigators of something they had discovered very early in the shed's investigation. There, in one of the coffins, numbered 7, they had found a mummified human hand that looked as if it had stiffened in an attempt to break free. The forensic technicians decided to thoroughly re-examine this find. After a renewed examination, an unusual discovery was made. Neatly placed over the desiccated hand was precisely that white sock, clean and obviously recently put on. This match unequivocally confirmed the connection between Mathilde and what was inside the coffins. Mathilde was again summoned for questioning. This time she was shown photos of the sock found on the hand. The investigators had expected her to be confused or deny her involvement, but Mathilde's reaction was completely different. The woman calmly confirmed that it was she herself who had put the socks on the remains, and that she considered this an obligation to them. According to her, it was her concern to care for them so that they would not be cold. Mathilde said this with complete indifference, as if speaking about something completely mundane and natural, and not something difficult to explain. It turned out that Mathilde's actions could no longer be explained by simple fraud or the desire to cover up her husband's deeds. Her behavior was not limited to merely concealing a crime. It resembled a personal ritual in which the woman found a deep inner meaning. For years, Mathilde bought children's socks and lavender talcum powder, constantly visited the shed, and strove to maintain cleanliness and order there. Particularly disturbing for the investigators was how naturally and without agitation Mathilde spoke of her actions, without understanding how strange and frightening this appeared from the outside. It became obvious to the investigators that Mathilde Giroux was not simply a person hiding the traces of others' crimes. Her actions pointed to direct involvement in the events that had taken place many years ago. She clearly felt responsible for what had happened, and did not deny this responsibility, but avoided saying directly what exactly she felt guilty for. From that moment on, Mathilde was officially considered the main suspect in the case. Although it was clear to everyone that her role was far more complex than just complicity in fraud or covering up her husband's crimes. Now, the investigator's task was to find out what past event had led Mathilde Giroux to persistently try to atone for her guilt for decades. When forensic technicians completed the primary identification of the remains, investigators had a clear picture of most of the individuals found. 8 of 12 were indeed unclaimed, people without family and relatives whose funerals had been financed by the church. These results perfectly aligned with the investigators' assumption about the fraud Alain Giroux might have committed. He received money from the community for cremation, but instead simply placed the coffins in the abandoned shed to avoid additional costs and effort. However, particular attention was drawn to the remains numbered 7, precisely the coffin in which the desiccated hand with the white sock had previously been found. This person was not on the community's lists registering cremations of solitary individuals. After checking all records, investigators found no single document that matched that period. This immediately aroused suspicion. It became clear that number 7 differed from the other findings and possibly was someone who had a family and could be sought by relatives. The investigators decided to proceed in a traditional manner. They published a brief description of the person and the circumstances of the discovery in the local newspaper, Iberville Post-Signal, and on the official website of the Saint-Bridget parish. The announcement was quite restrained and contained only the most necessary facts and characteristics. Nevertheless, the publication yielded an unexpected result. Just 3 days later, an important call was received by the police from a neighboring community. The callers introduced themselves as the Boudreau family and stated that the description matched their relative, Marcel Boudreau, who had disappeared in 1982. The Boudreau family told investigators in detail that they had actively searched for Marcel after his disappearance. After some time, Alain Giroux personally contacted them and informed them that Marcel had already been found dead and his remains cremated. The family was given an official receipt and an urn with ashes, whereupon they ceased their search, certain that the situation had been fully resolved. The investigators immediately met with the relatives. The family presented the documents and the urn itself, which they had kept for over 30 years. These papers left no doubt. A genuine receipt with Alain Giroux's stamp and signature confirmed payment for the cremation service. But now, with something found in the shed matching Marcel's description, a clear contradiction emerged. If Marcel Boudreau had indeed been cremated, who was in coffin number 7? To clarify this important question, the investigation ordered 2 crucial expert analyses. The first was a comparative genetic analysis of the DNA of the Boudreau family's relatives and the remains of person number 7. The second was a laboratory examination of the urn's contents to determine whether the content was human ashes or if Alain Giroux had defrauded the relatives by replacing it with something else. These new circumstances marked an important stage of the investigation and changed its original character. It could no longer be solely about cremation fraud and finances. If it were confirmed that coffin number 7 indeed belonged to Marcel, it would mean that Alain Giroux had not only embezzled church funds, but had also cynically defrauded the missing person's relatives by passing off a fake as genuine remains. Thus, the shed on the edge of the cemetery was no longer merely a place for people forgotten by the church. It transformed into a point where a lie had been hidden for years, carefully disguised as an official procedure. It became clear to the investigators that the story of the Giroux family funeral home was much darker and more convoluted than it initially seemed. The detectives' task now was to find out exactly what went on within the institute in the 80s and who, besides the Giroux family themselves, might have known about such crimes. The shed no longer appeared merely as a result of negligence or a desire to save money. It became a symbol of deeper and more unsettling events, the answers to which the investigators still had to uncover. While the experts conducted the DNA analysis and examined the contents of the Boudreau family's urn, the investigators decided to delve deeper into the Giroux family's living circumstances, focusing on the personality of the deceased Alain. The investigators' theory was that his actions and deeds formed the basis for subsequent events. In search of answers, the detectives reviewed the archives of the Port-Aulne Police Department, which had been preserved from the period when the funeral home was in operation, from the late 70s to the early 80s. Although the documents were not fully preserved, the materials found allowed them to paint a conflicting picture of a man behind whose actions unsettling circumstances were hidden. Police reports from that era documented 2 episodes where Alain Giroux had been arrested for driving under the influence of alcohol. Both cases were unusual as they occurred during his official duties in the hearse, which in itself seemed strange and suspicious. The documents also noted that the smell of alcohol was perceptible both from Alain himself and inside the vehicle. Such behavior seemed particularly inappropriate given the specifics of his work. Besides these cases, the archives also contained complaints from funeral home clients who were dissatisfied with Alain's negligence in issuing documents, failure to meet deadlines, and his appearance at meetings while intoxicated. In the small town, These episodes were superficially perceived as something insignificant. However, in light of the recent discoveries and the remains found, the entire situation presented itself to the investigators in a different light. Subsequently, the investigators located a former employee of the Institute, Lawrence Webb, who had worked under Alain's direction for many years. He confirmed that Alain regularly drank and was disorderly at work, often mixing up documents and making other mistakes. According to the assistant, such negligence had practically become the norm for Giraud, and the likelihood of a serious error was quite real. When the investigators heard this, they saw the case in a different light. Webb factually confirmed their suspicions that Alain's mistakes could have far-reaching and irreparable consequences. Meanwhile, Mathilda's behavior aroused increasing suspicion. The investigators gradually became convinced that her actions were connected to personal experiences and a secret she had hidden for many years. When questioning neighbors, it emerged that Mathilda regularly left the house late at night and walked towards the cemetery and the shed. Some neighbors had repeatedly seen her standing there at night, addressing an invisible interlocutor and speaking softly as if trying to have a conversation with someone long gone. One eyewitness even claimed to have heard Mathilda repeat her deceased husband's name, as if he were standing beside her. These actions seemed not only like compulsive behavior, but also evinced a deep emotional crisis and a hidden sense of guilt. During a renewed interrogation, it became clear to the investigators that Mathilda did not deny her husband's personal flaws and weaknesses. Moreover, her words confirmed the investigators' suspicions. Alain had indeed made a grave mistake, the consequences of which she had been trying to correct to this day. Mathilda avoided being specific, did not reveal the nature of her husband's mistake, and was visibly frightened by the need to disclose details of the past. She spoke evasively, broke off in mid-sentence, and obviously tried to avoid giving concrete facts. After this conversation, the investigators realized that the task was more difficult and convoluted than expected at the beginning of the investigation. This case was no longer limited to cremation fraud. It now became obvious that the Giraud family harbored a secret that was far darker and more serious than originally assumed. Alain's actions, which were the result of his irresponsibility and drunkenness, could have led to events that, even after decades, forced Mathilda herself to hide the truth and grapple with her own sense of guilt. Now, the investigators had to find out exactly what mistakes had been made, how severe their consequences were, and who else might have known about these tragic circumstances. 2 weeks after the experts began their work, the laboratory presented the investigators with the first results. It was the analysis of the contents of the urn, which the Boudreau family had kept for almost 40 years, believing it to be the last memory of their relative. The experts formulated their conclusions extremely succinctly. The report contained no conjectures or assumptions, only facts. The examination revealed the substance inside contained no biological particles, no fragments of bone structure, and no signs of thermal exposure characteristic of cremation. Essentially, the urn contained ordinary ash, likely from a domestic fireplace. This report changed the course of the investigation. Now it was obvious that Alain Giraud had deliberately deceived the Boudreau family by handing them fake ashes. This no longer seemed like negligence, rather a planned fraud. However, the answer to the main question remained open. Where was Marcel if his remains had not been cremated? The answer came with the results of the second expertise. This was the examination the investigators had awaited with particular attention. The laboratory compared the genetic samples of Marcel Boudreau's nephews with fragments of biomaterial taken from the remains found in the shed under number 7. After a 3-day review and double confirmation, the specialists produced a report. DNA match, 99.9%. It was not a guess, but an exact scientific fact. These 2 reports put an end to the previous version. The investigators had irrefutable evidence. The Boudreau family had been given a fake urn, and the real Marcel had lain in the old brick shed at Saint-Bridget Cemetery all those years. His remains had been there for almost 40 years, hidden behind a locked door, under a layer of dampness, dust, and the scented talcum powder with which Matilda had covered the coffins for years. After consolidating these facts, the investigators came to the obvious conclusion. They were dealing with more than just a fraud scheme. Alain Giroux's actions had a systematic character and indicated the deliberate concealment of a person's death. The fake urn, the fake documents, and the attempt to convince the relatives of a conducted cremation. All of this seemed like a carefully planned operation whose goal was not to make a profit, but to conceal the very existence of Marcel Boudreau. Subsequently, the investigators officially reclassified the case from a financial offense to an investigation related to a possible crime against a person. For the first time during the entire investigation, it was no longer about money. The question of why Alain Giroux had done everything to bury the truth came to the forefront. The shed on the edge of the cemetery was no longer perceived as a place where forgotten coffins were stored. It transformed into the epicenter of the entire story, a point where a lie had been preserved for almost 4 decades, disguised as a bureaucratic error. Now, a new chapter in the Giroux case opened before the investigators, and everyone knew that the explanation of what exactly had happened in that shed and why Matilda had continued to protect that place for decades was imminent. With the identity of person number 7 established, investigators had another crucial detail to clarify: the circumstances of Marcel Boudreau's death. The answer was to be provided by the pathologist, who had been tasked with conducting an in-depth analysis of the remains. Although they had lain there for almost 40 years, the mummification process had preserved some internal tissues, allowing for a detailed examination. The investigation lasted several days. The pathologist carefully documented all changes: the condition of the bones, tissue remnants, the penetration of clothing, and internal organs. It was precisely during the analysis of lung tissue samples that the experts made an unexpected discovery. Traces of formaldehyde, a substance that is a component of embalming fluid, were found in the samples. The expert emphasized in his report, formaldehyde could not have entered the respiratory tract naturally. Such a concentration is observed exclusively in cases where a person is still alive and continues to breathe at the moment the embalming procedure begins. This discovery led to an unexpected turn in the investigation. The investigators knew that the fluid is injected through the arteries, and a normal process excludes penetration into the lungs. This meant Marcel was breathing when the procedure began. The pathologist cautiously confirmed this in his expert opinion, noting the preserved respiratory activity of the affected person at the time of formaldehyde penetration. The investigators began to search for possible explanations for what had happened. Medical records of Marcel Boudreau were found at the hospital confirming his severe form of diabetes and repeated instances of hypoglycemic coma. Doctors noted that such conditions can easily be mistaken for death. Breathing becomes shallow. The pulse is practically absent. Under conditions of poor lighting or in a hurry, even a specialist could make a mistake in diagnosis. When the investigators cross-referenced this with known facts from Alain Giroux's biography, they obtained a logical picture of the events. In those years, Alain was often intoxicated and, according to the former assistant's statements, usually worked alone, without medical supervision. He had probably misdiagnosed Marcel's condition on that fateful day and started the embalming without verifying that the person was truly dead. To verify the hypothesis, forensic technicians re-examined coffin number 7. During the examination of the inside of the lid, they discovered deep, chaotic scratches at chest and head height. A forensic examination confirmed that the marks were from human fingernails. Furthermore, forensic technicians managed to identify letter fragments: A-T, O, M-O. Graphologists concluded that these marks had been made by a person from inside when the lid was already firmly closed. Marcel had already regained consciousness in the coffin but could not free himself. The expert report ruled out any doubt about the cause of death. It was now definitively clear that Marcel Boudreau had not died of natural causes. but as a result of a grave error by a person who had begun the embalming without verifying the patient's condition. These data gave the case a different character. From a fraud investigation, it became the investigation of a tragic incident that had been hidden for decades behind the walls of the old shed at Saint Bridget Cemetery. Once it was clear that Marcel Boudreau had died as a result of Alain Giroux's error, the investigation decided to scrutinize all possible parties connected to the case. One of these parties was the Boudreau family itself. Rumors spread quickly in Port-Aulne, and in the small town, people began to say that perhaps everything was not so clear-cut. In cases involving money and old grudges, motives sometimes shift direction. The investigators could not afford to overlook even a single detail. Documents preserved in the town archives showed that the Boudreau family had taken out a small loan, $750, shortly before Marcel's presumed death. This sum matched the amount on the receipt issued by Alain Giroux for the cremation. This coincidence seemed too precise for the investigators to ignore. The theory arose that the money might not have just been payment for a service, but something more. A kind of informal agreement between the family and the funeral home. As part of the review, financial records, correspondence, and statements from family members were examined. The investigators tried to understand if there might have been a prearranged scenario where the family knew of Marcel's fate but chose to conceal it. The theory sounded logical on paper. Marcel, according to acquaintances, was not very stable, often needed his relatives' help, and his life could indeed have been a heavy burden for the family. In those years, many people resolved such problems through third parties, especially when it came to individuals with addictions or illnesses. But conjectures alone were not enough. Further verification gradually refuted this hypothesis. The loan that had aroused suspicion was taken out only a few days after Alain Giroux informed the family of Marcel's death. The amount stated in the documents fully matched that on the receipt for the cremation. Thus, the money could not have been payment for the disappearance. On the contrary, it was a reaction to the news of the death. The family had simply borrowed money to pay for the funeral home's services. The alibi of the Boudreau relatives was also confirmed. In 1982, on the day Marcel arrived at the morgue, his brother and sister were in another community, where they were helping with seasonal work. These statements were confirmed by several independent witnesses, including the employer and neighbors. All timelines matched. The investigators concluded that the Boudreau family had nothing to do with the events at the funeral home. They had neither motives nor the ability to influence the outcome of the case. On the contrary, they themselves had become victims of the fraud, having kept a fake urn for years, believing they were laying a loved one to rest in peace. With this false lead finally ruled out, the investigators' attention once again turned to the Giroux family. After all the checks, it was clear that Alain's actions had led to the tragedy. And Mathilde, after learning about it, had spent her entire life trying to cope with that knowledge. For the police and the prosecutor's office, the case took on its final contours. The Giroux family's guilt was complete, and Marcel Boudreau's story was an example of how a single mistake can destroy multiple lives and linger long in a town's memory. After fully excluding the Boudreau family as suspects, the investigators' attention once again turned to Mathilde Giroux. By this point, it was already obvious that the entire tragedy had begun with her husband's mistake, but Mathilde's own behavior remained incomprehensible. The investigators wanted to find out why the woman returned to the shed for decades and meticulously cared for the grave sites, especially the one containing Marcel Boudreau. Forensic technicians decided to conduct a new, more detailed examination of the shed. This time, they were particularly interested in the seventh coffin, which belonged to Marcel. They found that the layer of lavender talcum powder on its surface was noticeably thicker than on the other coffins. The experts concluded that Mathilde had applied the talcum powder to this particular grave site many times more frequently than to the others. This testified to her special relationship with Marcel and her knowledge of the true reason for his death. Her actions seemed like an attempt to atone for her personal guilt towards the man who had suffered due to her husband's actions. Subsequently, the investigators decided to trace when and how the other coffins had appeared. Archival documents confirmed that all other burials had only ended up in the shed after the tragic incident with Marcel, starting in 1983. It turned out that Alain Giraud had organized the fraud scheme with the unclaimed precisely after this era. The regular manipulations with cremations were a way for him to hide the essential truth: the Marcel case. Each new coffin diverted attention and made the original crime appear less obvious by hiding it among many other cases. After Alain's death in 1995, Mathilde's life changed drastically. People who knew her from earlier times noticed significant changes in her behavior. She rarely left the house, avoided contact with neighbors, and appeared in public less and less frequently. Parishioners saw her come to church at the emptiest times, praying for a long time and lighting candles. She was often seen late at night walking to the shed with a small bundle in her hands. No one knew exactly why she did this, but now it became clear to the investigators that her walks were directly related to the burials in the shed. After reviewing the financial records, investigators found that Mathilde regularly bought talcum powder, weekly, without interruption, for many years. To those around her, her actions were inexplicable, but Mathilde herself perceived these visits to the shed as a way to cope with her inner guilt. It was her personal form of penance, a silent attempt to correct what could no longer be corrected. The investigators also noted that Mathilde had never attempted to leave town or hide. On the contrary, she seemed to deliberately remain near the place where her husband's secret was kept, emotionally tied to it and unable to detach herself from the past. As a result, the investigators came to the final conclusion that Mathilde was not directly involved in the crime itself, but her silence was a conscious choice that allowed the secret to persist for decades. Now, the investigators faced the task of evaluating the extent of her guilt and understanding what punishment or justification a person deserves who chose a life with another's secret instead of an open confession. This very question was to bring the Giroux family case to a close. After collecting all the evidence, the moment arrived for the final and most serious conversation with Mathilde. She was summoned for an interrogation where the main pieces of evidence against her were to be presented. The detectives had prepared carefully, knowing that this might be their last chance to obtain a direct confession from her. The interrogation room was quiet and still. The investigators knew Mathilde wouldn't simply talk without compelling reasons. Therefore, they began the conversation not with words, but with documents. One by one, they presented her with the reports that spoke against her and her husband. First, the analysis result of the ashes given to the Boudreau family was presented. The report stated that it was ordinary wood ash and not Marcel's remains. Mathilde looked at the papers almost indifferently. She made no comment on what she saw and barely moved, but the investigators methodically revealed card after card. Next came the report on the genetic expertise. Experts confirmed that the remains found in coffin number 7 undoubtedly belonged to Marcel Boudreau. Mathilde turned her gaze slightly to the side but continued to remain silent. After a short pause, another document was presented to her. It was the pathologist's final report on the formaldehyde discovered in the lungs. The detective explained that the only way for this substance to get there was if Marcel was still alive when the procedure began. Mathilde slightly clenched her fingers but again said no word. The investigator watched her attentively, waiting for some reaction. Thereupon, the detective pulled photos from the file that had been taken inside the coffin. The pictures clearly showed deep scratches on the inside of the lid. A handwriting expert had already confirmed that these marks were from a human trying to free themselves. Silence once again filled the room. Mathilde now stared straight ahead, and it was clear that she fully understood what was being discussed. After a long silence, the detective repeated all the facts, this time one after another, without omitting a single one. He did not raise his voice, Nor did he emphasize any emotions. He simply dryly enumerated each piece of evidence. When he reached the scratches on the coffin lid, Matilda visibly paled and closed her eyes to maintain her composure. The lawyer sitting next to her quietly requested a break. The investigators agreed. After a few minutes, the lawyer stated that Matilda was ready to make a confession, but asked for a deal. It was difficult for her to speak, each word costing her effort, but she admitted that she had known the truth all along. Matilda did not deny that she had helped her husband move the remains to the shed and admitted that it was she who had tried to erase the traces of the crime. She did not speak of her feelings or regret, but merely briefly confirmed all the facts the investigator had listed. The detective noted her words in even handwriting, without comments or questions. After 1 hour, the protocol was signed. The final interrogation was over and had provided the investigators with everything necessary to hand the case over to the court. After Matilda's confession, investigators were able to fully reconstruct the events of that day and for the first time, see the complete picture. It was now clear how and why Marcel Boudreau ended up in the shed at the cemetery. It all began on May 14, 1982. Marcel, suffering from diabetes, had collapsed unconscious on a public street. Passers-by called an ambulance, but doctors, unable to detect a pulse, presumed him dead. He was taken to the city morgue and registered as unidentified. Thus began a chain of errors that ended in catastrophe. The next day, May 15, Alain Giroux, the owner of the local funeral home, came to collect the body for another cremation. On that day, he was intoxicated, which was not unusual for him. The morgue staff had known him for many years and paid no attention to his condition. Alain took Marcel's body without checking the papers or inquiring about the cause of death. Back at his institute, he immediately began the usual embalming procedure. Everything proceeded as normal until Marcel suddenly regained consciousness in pain. As the formaldehyde entered his lungs, he began to breathe and move. For Alain, this moment became a nightmare. He realized that he had begun the procedure while the man was still alive. Instead of stopping and calling doctors, Alain panicked. The thought of being accused of negligence, which would destroy his reputation and deprive him of his livelihood, was stronger than any sense of guilt. Out of fear of the consequences, he decided to cover up what had happened. He placed Marcel in a coffin and closed the lid, unable to think clearly. At that moment, fear was stronger than reason. When Matilda returned home, she immediately understood what had happened. Alain told her everything, without trying to justify himself. She was faced with the decision upon which her entire future life depended. Despite the horror of the situation, she chose silence. Together, they took the coffin to the old brick shed on the edge of Saint-Bridget Cemetery, hoping that this place would remain undiscovered. A few weeks after Marcel's disappearance, his family came to the funeral home. They wanted an explanation, and that's when Alain presented them with a false version. He claimed that Marcel had been found dead and had already been cremated according to his will. As confirmation, he handed them an urn with ashes from the Institute's fireplace. The family left, believing every word. For many years, they lived with this version, believing their relative had been buried as he wished. Alain died without revealing the truth, and Matilda remained silent for decades, secretly continuing to visit the shed. Only her confession allowed the investigators to piece together all elements of the story and definitively confirm what had happened in May 1982. The investigation, which had lasted several months and required the involvement of numerous specialists, was finally nearing its conclusion. The investigators officially recorded the findings regarding the role of each participant. Alain Giroux's guilt, he having long passed away, was fully proven and entered into the case files. The collected evidence confirmed that he had negligently caused Marcel Boudreau's death through his criminal negligence, and had also committed fraud related to fictitious cremations. Bringing him to justice was, of course, no longer possible, but legally establishing his role proved to be extremely important for justice. The decision regarding Mathilde Giraud was far more difficult. At that time, she was 85 years old and her physical and mental state raised serious doubts. Nevertheless, based on the facts and her own confession, Mathilde was officially charged with obstruction of justice, as well as in 11 counts of fraud and disturbance of the dead. Mathilde did not deny her involvement, but emphasized that she had acted all along under pressure from her husband and circumstances, out of fear of the collapse of her family life. Now the court faced a difficult dilemma. How should the extent of responsibility be determined for a person who did not commit the crime herself, but knowingly helped to cover it up while in a difficult psychological state? Lively discussions began among townspeople. Some believed Mathilde had to bear full responsibility. Others pointed to her advanced age and poor health. The trial began on February 10, 2019. In addition to the main participants in the trial, journalists also appeared in the courtroom, eager to personally witness the outcome of the sensational case. The judge immediately admonished those present for silence, given the sensitive nature of the matter. Marcel Boudreau's family took the stand first. The relatives described how the disappearance of a loved one had been the cause of their suffering for many years. When they learned the truth, they experienced profound shock and disappointment. The ashes they had kept all those years turned out to be ordinary ashes from the Giroux Institute's fireplace. While the family testified, Mathilde seemed distant in thought, only occasionally looking blankly ahead. Then the court turned to the medical report presented by forensic psychiatry. Experts confirmed that Mathilde's condition had significantly worsened by the time of the trial. Doctors diagnosed her with moderate dementia, due to which she had partially lost her memory and could no longer fully grasp the events taking place and their consequences. This report caused noticeable unrest in the courtroom. Now the jury had to decide how much Mathilde's medical condition should influence the final verdict. After a long deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom and announced their decision. They found Mathilde Giraud guilty on all charges, but at the same time clearly indicated that her health, advanced age, and the influence her husband had exerted over her for many years had to be taken into maximum consideration. Thus, Mathilde was formally guilty, yet the jury recommended a significant mitigation of the sentence, emphasizing all the complex circumstances under which she had made her decisions. Now the decision lay with the judge, who had to definitively determine what awaited Mathilde and how her age and health would affect the sentence. As the judge entered the courtroom, conversations instantly ceased. People turned to him, awaiting the decision that would close the case that had spanned 4 decades. The judge took his seat, opened the documents, and calmly began to read the verdict. He listed the investigators' conclusions, the paragraphs, dates, statements. His voice remained even, without pauses or emphasis. The court acknowledged that Alain Giroux's guilt was fully proven. His negligence had led to Marcel Boudreau's death, and the following years of fictitious cremations had been an attempt to cover up the consequences of this error. Everything was documented, and this fact was now considered proven. Then the judge came to Mathilde Giraud. He read the charges: obstruction of justice and 11 counts of fraud. Complete silence reigned in the courtroom. People listened silently without looking around. Only the lawyer leaned slightly forward. Mathilde sat motionless, hands in her lap, gaze fixed on one point. It seemed as if she was only waiting for everything to be over. After a brief pause, the judge recalled the medical report. Doctors had diagnosed Mathilde with dementia and noted that she had partially lost the ability to understand what was happening and required constant care. The court took this into account. Then the judge emphasized that Mathilde was not the initiator of the crime. She acted under her husband's influence, was in a dependent relationship, and was afraid. At the same time, the court noted that her silence had lasted for decades and had become part of the obstruction of justice, which was why the Boudreau family had lived in ignorance for many years. He spoke calmly, but every word sounded determined and clear. After announcing all points, the judge came to the decision. The court found Mathilde Giraud guilty on all charges, but imposed a sentence taking into account her age, illness, and the absence of personal gain. The verdict: 5 years of probation with subsequent placement in a closed geriatric facility where she would be under the supervision of doctors and social workers. When the judge finished reading, there were neither shouts nor applause in the courtroom. People sat quietly, some with their gazes lowered. Marcel Boudreau's relatives appeared calm, as if they were merely waiting for the formalities to conclude. Mathilde showed no emotion, only nodded once when a court officer helped her to stand. The judge gathered his papers, thanked the participants in the trial, and declared the session closed. Slowly, people rose from their seats and began to leave. No one said a word. It was neither a victory nor a defeat, simply the end of a story that everyone had carried for far too long. Later, journalists would write short notes about the verdict. In the town, the names Giraud and Boudreau would be remembered again, debated as to who was more guilty and who less. But with time, the case would disappear from the news and remain in Port-Aulne's memory as an example of how a single mistake, made out of fear, can change the lives of several generations. After the verdict, Mathilde was transferred to a geriatric facility outside the town. She lived there quietly, almost without contact. The nurses remembered that she rarely spoke and spent most of her time alone. In March 2020, Mathilde died. The details she had not told the investigators she took with her. In Port-Aulne, life gradually returned to its usual rhythm. However, the topic of the Giraud shed still came up in conversations for a long time. Too many years had passed between the error and its discovery. After a few months, the St. Bridget parish organized the reburial of the discovered remains. They were assigned a burial plot in the cemetery, and the ceremony took place without much fanfare. The priest gave a short speech about peace and remembrance. The Boudreau family stood apart. For them, this day marked the end of a wait that had lasted almost 40 years. After the ceremony, they drove away in silence without discussing anything with each other. 1 week later, contractor Ryan Falk returned to the place where it all began and tore down the old shed. He gave no comments and did not appear in the news. The site was completely cleared and the plot of land remained empty. Later, at the town's expense, a small memorial plaque was installed with the names of the 9 identified and 3 unknown individuals. It was unveiled without ceremony, simply attached to a stone by the roadside. Today, few people stop there. Sometimes someone lays flowers, but mostly people pass by. The story of the Giraud family did not become a legend and did not generate new rumors. It simply remained a part of local memory, a silent reminder of how a single decision can change the lives of several people. Officially, the Giraud family case was closed. The investigation and the court had clarified all essential circumstances. Alain's guilt in fraud and in the negligent killing of Marcel Boudreau was proven. Mathilde was found guilty of obstruction of justice and aiding and abetting fraud. Everyone involved in what had happened had since died, and the investigators had no one left to turn to for answers. The case files were sent to the archive, and after a few months, not even journalists remembered it. Nevertheless, there was one point in the forensic medical report that hardly anyone paid attention to. The toxicological analysis could only be performed on Marcel Boudreau's remains, as these were the best preserved. The remaining remains had lain in the shed for too long and had been exposed to constant moisture, which completely ruled out the possibility of examining them for formaldehyde in the lungs. As a result, not a single expert could confirm or refute whether something similar had happened to any of the other 11 people who had lain next to Marcel all those years. Thus, the question of whether Marcel's story was the only tragic case or merely the first in a chain of similar errors remained unanswered. Officially, it was assumed that the other individuals found in the shed were already dead when they were brought to the Giraud Institute, but without a complete verification, this remained only a conjecture by the investigators. based on indirect facts and circumstances. In Port Olne, no one tried to get to the bottom of the truth anymore, and the townspeople no longer revisited this case. Over the years, it was spoken of less and less, and the discussions gradually faded. Some of the older residents sometimes mentioned the Giroux story in conversations, but they too preferred not to speculate on how many secrets might still be hidden in the archive folders or in the memories of Mathilda and Alain. Ultimately, the answers to these questions disappeared along with Mathilda and her husband. All that remained was to accept that not all secrets can be uncovered to the end. Sometimes the truth is buried too deep to be found even after decades. This uncertainty became the last, unsolvable legacy of the story Alain Giroux had once begun when he performed his work negligently. When David Chen first heard the loud voices from his neighbor's house, he didn't even turn his head in their direction. He just turned up the volume of the hockey game on TV, trying not to think about what was happening there. Mark and Chloe had been living next door for several months, and sometimes there were arguments between them. Nothing unusual. But this time was different. The voices grew louder, sharper, and after just a few minutes, David distinctly heard Chloe's scream, so piercing that it made him uneasy. Almost immediately after the scream, there was a loud bang, sounding like furniture falling over. For a moment, he froze. It was obvious that the situation was getting out of control, but David rationalized that he shouldn't interfere. He turned up the TV even louder to drown out the disturbance and return to the game. In the following hours, the noise from the neighbor's house alternately grew louder and softer. David was already beginning to calm down, thinking that everything was gradually resolving itself. But around midnight, he heard Chloe's voice again. Short, sharp, breaking off mid-word. And then an absolute silence descended, which seemed more unsettling to him than all the previous noises. Realizing that something serious had happened, David turned off the TV sound, picked up his phone, and dialed 911. He didn't yet know that his call would be the first step in an investigation that would uncover the true story of that night in Mark and Chloe's house. Until that evening, Mark and Chloe seemed like a perfectly ordinary, happy couple. At least, that's what their neighbors said. The police officers who arrived at the scene initially couldn't understand how such a loud scandal could have happened in a house that seemed ideal from the outside. When Mark and Chloe first moved to Aspen Woods in August 2022, they quickly became the talk of the town among locals. A young couple. He, 28 years old. She, 26 years old. Mark, a promising architect who had recently begun to receive good commissions. And Chloe, a florist whose arrangements often adorned local weddings and events. To the neighbors, they seemed like people for whom everything was in order. Prosperity, careers, beautiful smiles on their faces. Every morning, Mark went jogging, smiling and greeting neighbors, while Chloe usually tended to the garden around the house, sometimes even giving bouquets of flowers to her female neighbors just because. A family from the other end of the street later described to investigators that they had never seen the two of them even slightly irritated with each other. Everything seemed so calm and harmonious that some of the neighbors were even a little envious. The house, which the couple had bought less than 1 year ago, quickly became one of the most well-maintained on the street. Mark had designed the backyard himself, and Chloe had planted the front garden with flowers as if preparing for a gardening competition. But behind this well-maintained facade lay a completely different reality. Only later would the police find documents that showed another side of their cohabitation. Unpaid bills and credit card statements emerged, which Chloe had carefully hidden from Mark. The neighbors knew nothing of this. To them, the couple remained exemplary. The police officers would be even more surprised when they discovered Mark's suitcase by the front door. He had obviously intended to leave the house, and this was not a vacation or business trip. His belongings were packed as if he had no plans to return. The image of an ideal life crumbled piece by piece with each new document, each new testimony. Very soon it became clear that the evening of March 15 was not an accident, but the result of a long accumulation of problems hidden from prying eyes. As the patrol car approached the silent house, the police officers were sure they would be dealing with an ordinary domestic dispute. But just a few minutes after their arrival, they understood that everything was much more serious. That night changed not only their perception of Mark and Chloe, but also the neighborhood itself, where people were used to thinking that everything was always fine next door. When the officers drove to Mark and Chloe's house, everything seemed suspiciously quiet and calm. The patrol officers got out of the car, looked at the well-maintained yard, and carefully approached the front door. The door was closed, but when Officer Jefferson pushed it lightly, it swung open inwards without resistance. It immediately became clear that behind it lay a completely different picture, one that the neighbors had never seen and could not even imagine. The first thing the police noticed was the disarray in the hallway and living room, an overturned coffee table, scattered magazines and decorative items, a fallen table lamp. It gave the impression that a serious fight or brawl had taken place there. But as the officers inspected the ground floor, it became obvious that the most important events had occurred upstairs, on the second floor of the house. As Officer Jefferson ascended the stairs, he was the first to see the open bedroom door. On the floor next to the bed lay Mark. He was motionless, and even a fleeting glance from the officers made them realize that he could no longer be helped. Later, the forensic pathologists would confirm in their official report, Mark had sustained more than 20 stab wounds. The investigators carefully noted that around the spot where Mark lay, there were many small details indicating the man's attempts to defend himself: an overturned chair, torn clothing, and several scattered personal items. At the same time, another officer, Sanders, discovered Chloe on the ground floor. She was sitting on the floor in a corner of the living room, leaning against the wall with obvious signs of shock. On her hands and shoulders, she had small superficial cuts that had already dried. She seemed disoriented, but immediately began to speak when the police officer approached her. Panic was audible in her voice, but her words sounded clear. Chloe told the police that the evening had started completely normally. Around 8 o'clock, when she and Mark were home, they suddenly heard the sound of a broken window and 2 unknown men had entered the house. They wore masks, and she couldn't make out any details. She claimed the robbers had tied them up and demanded money for several hours, threatening and intimidating them. She repeated that they couldn't do anything as there was simply no cash in the house. According to Chloe, the men had acted aggressively and didn't want to hear any excuses. At some point, the situation got out of control, and one of the robbers attacked Mark. She herself miraculously survived and was only able to free herself after the attackers had left the house. The police recorded her statement, noting every word in detail. The story sounded horrifying and strange at the same time. There were indeed many signs of a break-in and a struggle, but something struck the officers as suspicious during the initial investigation. For example, they noticed that valuable items, electronics, jewelry, watches, remained untouched. This didn't quite fit a typical robbery scenario. Nevertheless, the initial version of events was officially recorded: a robbery in which Mark was killed by unknown individuals and Chloe was injured and miraculously survived. The police officers did not yet know that this version would very soon rapidly collapse, and the evidence found would force them to view the events of the night from a completely different perspective. Chloe's version of the attack by strangers seemed convincing enough to be taken seriously at first. However, the detectives who arrived at the crime scene 1 hour after the patrol officers immediately sensed that something was amiss. In such cases, one first looks for signs of a break-in and possible evidence left behind by the attackers. This is exactly what the forensic technicians began to check first. The house was meticulously examined by a team of forensic technicians led by Detective Michael Turner. They began with a thorough inspection of the front door and the ground floor windows to find any signs of forced entry. The door was undamaged, the lock worked perfectly, and this immediately aroused the police's suspicion. because according to Chloe, the attackers had entered precisely through the living room window. In that case, obvious signs of a break-in should have been left behind. As the forensic technicians began to examine the windows more closely, their gaze fell upon the broken window to the left of the main entrance. The officers carefully checked the window frame and sill for fingerprints, shoe prints, and any potential traces that the uninvited guests might have left. Surprisingly, however, no foreign prints were found, neither on the frame nor on the fragments of broken glass. This raised the first serious questions about Chloe's statement. For according to her words, the men had spent about 4 hours in the house, which meant that at least some traces should have remained. The forensic technicians decided to expand the search area and began to investigate the vicinity of the window. At that moment, an expert examining the exterior of the house noticed an important detail which he immediately reported to Detective Turner. The shards of broken glass were not inside the living room as they should have been if impacted from the outside, but on the contrary, outside, directly on the well-maintained lawn in front of the house. Forensic technician Michael Lewis documented this important finding and took several photographs. After carefully examining the damage pattern, he came to the unequivocal conclusion: the impact had occurred from inside the room. This meant that the window had not been smashed by attackers from outside, but by someone who was already inside the house. This discovery fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. The entire scenario Chloe had described was now in doubt. The forensic technicians re-examined the area and found not the slightest sign of the presence of unknown individuals. No shoe prints on the floor, no traces of gloves or clothing on the windowsill. Turner listened carefully to the forensic technician's report and silently looked around. His gaze fell on another strange fact: expensive equipment, a computer, several valuable pieces of furniture were clearly visible in the living room. All of this remained completely untouched, even though Chloe had claimed the attackers had demanded money and acted aggressively. The police began to understand that they were facing a completely different situation than they had expected, based on the words of the sole witness. They began to re-examine the crime scene, this time with a different perspective, meticulously noting and correlating every detail. The fact of the broken window with the shards facing outwards no longer seemed merely like a piece of evidence, but as the main contradiction in Chloe's version. Detective Turner understood that he faced a much more difficult task: to find out why the woman, who was obviously in the house at the time of the tragedy, was making statements that did not align with the obvious facts. One thing was clear: Chloe's story had already begun to unravel in the first hours after the investigation began. And the window smashed from the inside became the first step towards uncovering the truth about what really happened on the night of March 15 in the quiet suburb of Aspen Woods. As Chloe's story about an attack by strangers began to unravel, the detectives had to pause and re-evaluate the situation. In such cases, the investigation proceeds according to a clear method. First, the possibility of an intrusion is examined, and if the facts do not confirm it, the police turn their attention to those who were already inside. Exactly such a scenario was now unfolding in Mark and Chloe's house, although at first glance it seemed to be a tragedy caused by external intervention. Chloe, who until now had been perceived by the police solely as a witness, became the first person to draw the investigators' attention. It wasn't even about how she had behaved during the initial conversation with the patrol officers, but about the fact that her story clearly contradicted the evidence found. Not a single trace was found at the crime scene that could have belonged to anyone else. Neither shoe prints nor fingerprints on door handles and furniture. This seemed strange and suspicious, especially after her claims about the long presence of two strangers in the house. Detective Michael Turner instructed his colleagues to thoroughly re-examine the house. The forensic technicians used special equipment that could detect even the smallest traces invisible to the naked eye. And again, the result was zero. No foreign traces in the house. And this could only mean one thing: the event had taken place exclusively between those who lived there permanently, between Mark and Chloe. Now it was obvious that the police had no choice but to investigate the couple's living circumstances more closely. And the first step was a careful observation of Chloe herself. The police officers noted her every word, recorded reactions to questions, and looked for signs of lying or nervousness. Interestingly, Chloe herself behaved relatively calmly, repeating her story almost verbatim, as if she had memorized it. But in addition to her behavior, the investigators had to find physical confirmations or refutations of her words. And at that very moment, one of the officers made an important discovery. By the front door, right in the hallway, stood a half-packed men's suitcase. The suitcase looked as if it had been packed quickly and carelessly. Inside were clothes, documents, bank cards, and everyday items. The passport belonged to Mark, and from the packed items it immediately became clear he had intended to leave the house for a long time, if not forever. The police immediately photographed the find and began to form a preliminary picture. The suitcase meant that Mark had been preparing to leave that evening. He had obviously intended to leave secretly and quickly, and perhaps that was precisely the reason for the conflict that neighbor David Chen had heard several hours earlier. This discovery completely changed the direction of the investigation. Now only Chloe could be the suspect, because no one else could have known Mark's plans better than she. Detective Turner immediately requested information about the couple's private life, financial matters, and relationships within the family. He suspected that Mark had a serious reason to leave, and it was precisely this decision that could have triggered the events the police were now trying to unravel. The investigators began to ponder motives. Why would a successful architect, living in a well-maintained house and according to all the neighbors, in a happy marriage, suddenly decide to abandon everything and leave without warning anyone? The suitcase was not just a piece of evidence. It became the key that could unlock a completely different side of this couple's life, hidden behind a facade of smiles and greetings to neighbors. From that moment on, the focus of the investigation shifted completely to Chloe. Her version now seemed not only strange, but also doubtful. The police had a concrete suspect, and with that, the understanding that something much larger than a family dispute or a random conflict lay behind this story. Now the investigators understood that the answer was not to be sought in the statements of the sole surviving witness, but in her past and the couple's life circumstances hidden from everyone. The more closely the police officers examined the circumstances of this case, the more facts spoke against the version Chloe had told. Now the investigation had two important details in hand that could definitively shatter her story about the attack by two strangers. These seemingly insignificant details revealed a completely different picture of that evening. The first of these was that very suitcase discovered at the front door. The investigators documented its contents in detail. Inside were Mark's passport, several items of clothing, a phone charging cable, personal effects, and toiletries. The items had been packed in a hurry, but it was perfectly obvious that they were not intended for a short trip. Usually, when going on vacation or a business trip, one does not take absolutely everything needed for daily life. Mark was clearly planning to leave for a long time, perhaps even forever. The detectives immediately began to meticulously examine each item. The passport and bank cards, these are items one typically takes when preparing for a definitive departure. A few important documents and cash were also found within, which would not have been necessary for a normal short business trip. This suitcase clearly told the police. Mark was not just preparing to leave, he wanted to start a new life, far away from this house where he seemingly had everything one needs to be happy. Now that the motive for Mark's departure became obvious, the officers turned to the second important detail, the nature of Chloe's injuries. She claimed she had sustained them during the struggle with the attackers, but the medical examiner who had examined her immediately upon arrival at the scene came to a completely different conclusion. The official report stated that all the cuts on her hands and shoulders were not deep and posed no threat to life. They were clean, carefully executed, and more closely resembled an attempt to feign a struggle than genuine injuries typically sustained in a fight with aggressive criminals. Furthermore, the experts noted another important detail. There were no signs of struggle on Chloe's clothing or skin that would typically remain in such situations. No abrasions, no hematomas that should have occurred as a result of defending against an attack. The wounds were clean and clearly localized in places a person can easily reach themselves. This made the investigators very suspicious, as it once again contradicted her story about the brutal actions of the strangers. The investigative team carefully compared these two findings with Chloe's original statements. Altogether, they painted a completely different story. No attack from outside, but an internal conflict involving only two people, Chloe herself and her husband Mark. The suitcase showed that Mark was preparing to leave forever, and the nature of the wounds on the woman's hands indicated an attempt to cover up the truth about what had happened. Now the investigators were certain there were no real attackers in the house. Instead, events unfolded according to a completely different scenario. Chloe's version became less credible with each passing hour. Every new detail refuted her words and indicated that the woman not only knew the truth, but might also be trying to carefully conceal it. By the end of the first day of the investigation, none of the police officers doubted that there was far more to this story than a family conflict or an attempted robbery. Now they had to clarify the motives that had led Chloe to fabricate such a brutal scenario and play the role of a victim. Mark's suitcase and the nature of her wounds clearly showed that the conflict had taken place within the house, and the key to understanding it lay deep within the couple's relationship. The next task of the investigation was even more difficult. It was to understand the reasons for this conflict, to uncover the secrets that had led to the tragic outcome, and to find out why Mark had so urgently decided to leave the woman with whom, in the opinion of those around them, he was completely happy. The motive now became the main question, and it was precisely on this that the detectives decided to concentrate all their efforts in the coming days. As investigators began to examine the circumstances of the case more closely and carefully analyze the available evidence, Chloe's behavior became another factor that raised serious doubts about her story. It seemed that a person who had survived such an event should behave quite differently. Usually, the sole witness actively cooperates with investigators, trying to recall all the details, describing the attackers in detail, even if the memories are fragmented and traumatic. But Chloe behaved quite differently. In the reports that the detectives compiled after the initial conversations with her, it was noted that Chloe's answers were astonishingly vague and contradictory. She constantly got entangled in details. For example, she initially claimed the attackers were tall and strong, but later she could no longer accurately describe their build, height, or even the color of their clothes. When asked to explain how exactly they had entered the house, her explanations sounded uncertain and confused. She said she had heard glass shatter, but later could not precisely specify where this sound came from. The detectives also noted in the reports that when asked to describe the attacker's actions in detail, Chloe either responded with general phrases or began to repeat what she had already said before, almost word for word, as if trying to recall a prepared text from memory. Chloe's emotional state was also unstable, but not quite as it usually is in victims of similar incidents. Detective Michael Turner noted in his records that the woman periodically fell into a state of intense fear, after which she suddenly and abruptly became calmer and began to speak more quietly and distantly. Sometimes it seemed as if she was in complete control of the situation, carefully monitoring what questions she was asked and how she formulated her answers. At other times, she would suddenly start crying, but in a way that suggested she was trying to display emotions rather than truly feeling them. This fact immediately struck the police psychologist, who noted that her behavior looked atypical for a person genuinely experiencing such a traumatic event. Police reports also indicate that Chloe avoided eye contact with the detectives when they began asking questions about her personal relationship with Mark or about his plans to leave. She would either look away or nervously adjust her clothes as if trying to gain extra time to formulate her next answer. The police also noticed that she displayed distinct caution when the conversation turned to financial matters, evading answers and repeating that Mark exclusively handled those things and that she knew nothing about his plans or the family's financial situation. During the first day of communication with the investigators, Chloe changed the tone of the conversation several times. In the morning, she seemed confused and scared. Around noon, she suddenly became irritable and withdrawn, and by evening, her answers took on an extremely cautious and reserved character. The investigators noted that her responses became increasingly withdrawn and monosyllabic after each new conversation. It seemed that Chloe simply wanted to end these conversations as quickly as possible without revealing any new information. One day after the investigation began, when Detective Turner scheduled another interrogation, an unexpected turn of events occurred. Chloe completely refused to speak with the investigators, stating that she would only speak with the detectives in the presence of an attorney. She made this decision suddenly and quite categorically, without explaining the reasons. The very next day, her representative officially informed the police that his client would no longer make any statements without legal counsel. Such a turn of events became a serious obstacle for the investigation, as all further attempts to obtain statements directly from her were blocked. Now the detectives had to completely change their investigative tactics and look for new sources of information. They began to question neighbors, friends, relatives of the couple, examined phone calls, correspondence, financial documents, everything that could shed light on the true reasons for Chloe's behavior and the conflict with Mark. Chloe's refusal to cooperate meant only one thing. She sensed that the police were close to uncovering the truth. This step not only confirmed the detectives' doubts, but also showed that behind this entire story lay something deeper and more complex than a simple family dispute or a random event. Now the investigators understood that the answer was not to be sought in the statements of the sole surviving witness, but in her past and the couple's life circumstances hidden from everyone. The investigators understood that Chloe's refusal to continue conversations with them significantly complicated their task. However, they also knew that in similar cases, the most valuable source of information is often not the individuals involved themselves, but their relatives and acquaintances. It was for this very reason that the detectives methodically began to investigate Mark and Chloe's circle of acquaintances. They wanted to understand to whom Mark might have confided his intentions, and if there was anyone he fully trusted and to whom he could have confided his concerns that very evening. They didn't have to look far. On the second day after the incident, Mark's sister Emma contacted the police. Her appearance in the investigation became a real breakthrough. Her statements proved to be so important that they practically completely changed the course of the case, forcing investigators to view what had happened from a completely different perspective. Emma voluntarily came to the police station and immediately agreed to speak with Detective Michael Turner. During the conversation, she was visibly agitated, pausing several times to collect her thoughts, but nevertheless provided detailed and coherent statements that revealed the most important details of that day. According to her, Mark called her unexpectedly on the evening of March 15, around 7:30. She immediately felt in her brother's voice that something serious had happened. Emma relayed his words to the detectives, which became the most important piece of evidence in the case. Mark told his sister that he had completely accidentally come across bank statements and credit accounts that Chloe had hidden. These documents clearly showed that Chloe had long been concealing huge debts from him. It was tens of thousands of dollars. He sounded agitated and irritated, and Emma told the police that she had never heard her brother so desperate and depressed at the same time before. According to Emma, Mark told her he was completely shocked by such a lie, could no longer tolerate the deception, and had decided to leave Chloe immediately. He was firmly resolved to pack his belongings that very evening and leave the house forever. Emma tried to calm her brother, asked him not to make hasty decisions, but Mark was unyielding. At the end of the conversation, he said a sentence that later became crucial to understanding the situation. "I can no longer live with a person who has betrayed me so easily and for so long. I'm leaving today, and I'm not sure Chloe will take it calmly." Mark's sister remembered these words verbatim, and Detective Turner particularly emphasized this detail in his notes. For the investigation, this was a real turning point, because now Emma's words directly connected the suitcase found at the door with the motive for Mark's departure. The suitcase was no longer a random detail. It now became part of a coherent and consistent picture of what had happened. Mark obviously intended to leave, and his departure was caused by serious and long-standing problems in their relationship. After the conversation with Emma, the detectives once again checked all of Chloe's bank accounts and credit reports, which had previously only been part of the overall picture. The documents confirmed Mark's words. Chloe indeed had major financial problems. She was taking out loans and hiding the true state of affairs from her husband, paying off previous debts with new loans. Such a financial pyramid could collapse at any moment, and that moment had come when Mark accidentally discovered the documents. Now, the picture of what happened in the house began to come together in a completely different way. It became obvious that the reason for the conflict between Mark and Chloe was not a random argument, not a sudden attack by strangers, but a long-term lie that had gradually accumulated and led to a critical point. And when Mark discovered the truth, it meant one thing for him: an immediate and final separation from Chloe. The investigators were certain that Mark, after this conversation with his sister, immediately began packing his things. The suitcase by the door fully confirmed this version of events. Now all that remained was to understand how Chloe reacted to this decision and what actions she took that evening. The investigation no longer doubted. Chloe knew exactly that her husband wanted to leave, and most likely a violent conflict erupted between them due to this decision. Emma's testimony became the most important evidence for the police, as all previously found details now perfectly aligned with her narrative. The investigators no longer considered a random attack or a robbery as possible motives for what happened. Their attention was now completely focused on the family conflict and the couple's personal relationships. Precisely therein lay the motive for what happened on March 15 in the house. Now the detectives had to find out what exactly happened after Mark informed Chloe of his decision to leave. Emma's testimony definitively dispelled all the investigators' doubts about the causes and motives of the conflict. Their task was now to reconstruct the events in the house piece by piece, to understand Chloe's reaction to her husband's words, and to find out how the family drama could have reached such an extreme point, which everyone was now trying to speak of, carefully and reservedly. While the detectives were trying to understand what was emotionally happening between Mark and Chloe, the forensic technicians took care of the practical side of the question. Their task was clearly defined: to confirm or refute witness statements with physical evidence. For human words can mislead, memory can deceive, but science almost always provides clear and unambiguous answers. The investigative team requested an additional forensic examination of the house, using special chemical agents that can detect even the smallest traces invisible to the naked eye. In such cases, luminol is usually used, a substance that reveals hidden traces left behind after a conflict. The experts treated floors, walls, furniture, door handles, literally every square inch of the house to reconstruct the complete picture of what happened. The results of this analysis were astonishing. First, the forensic technicians discovered signs of a struggle in the living room. These traces were meticulously documented and showed that the events in this room had unfolded gradually. The investigators saw a clear picture of Mark and Chloe's movement through the room. The conflict began near the sofa and coffee table, then gradually moved towards the exit of the room, to the stairs, and further into the kitchen. In the kitchen, luminol revealed even more details. Hidden traces were found there, indicating that the conflict had intensified significantly at this location. Stains were discovered on the floor and kitchen furniture, suggesting that one of the participants tried to defend himself, while the other obviously tried to stop him. The experts carefully examined every trace and discovered an interesting detail. A part of the traces clearly corresponded to the actions of a person trying to leave the room, and another part to the actions of those trying to keep the other person in the room. This aligned with the version that one of the conflict participants wanted to leave, and the other wanted to prevent this. But the key location for understanding what happened was the bedroom on the second floor. There, the traces were most distinct and numerous. The experts immediately concluded that the conflict had reached its climax here. Based on the traces on the floor and furniture, it was obvious that Mark had been cornered and had tried by all means to avoid further confrontation. His attempts to leave were unsuccessful, and this was confirmed by the arrangement of the discovered stains and traces. Furthermore, the forensic technicians carefully examined the knife that had been found under the sofa in the living room. This knife became the central piece of evidence, as fingerprints of two people, Mark and Chloe, were found on it. The dactyloscopic examination clearly confirmed both had held the knife in their hands, and the experts noted that they had held it simultaneously while being in immediate proximity to each other. This meant that an active struggle for this object took place between them. In addition, the forensic technicians indicated in their report that the nature and arrangement of the prints on the knife clearly suggested that this struggle was not brief. The prints were blurred and overlapped, which is typical for a prolonged altercation. This fact became the decisive argument against the version of a sudden attack by unknown persons, which Chloe had so persistently repeated. The experts clearly stated in the report only two people were involved in the struggle for the knife, and both were residents of this house. An additional examination of Chloe's clothing revealed yet another strange detail. The traces she described as the result of an attack by unknown individuals were in reality too clean and unnatural. They were more consistent with attempts to stage a fight than with a genuine altercation. This once again confirmed the police's suspicion that Chloe was trying to artificially create the appearance of events that had not actually occurred. At the end of their report, the forensic technicians came to an unequivocal conclusion. All collected evidence confirms that the conflict within the house was exclusively internal. No unknown persons were involved in the struggle. The nature of the bloodstains and prints, their sequence and arrangement, argued for a prolonged altercation between two individuals who knew each other well and who, for some reason, had entered into a serious confrontation. Now, there was no doubt that Chloe's version of the attack did not correspond to reality. The scientific data clearly showed that a serious and prolonged argument had occurred between the spouses that evening, the cause of which was Mark's decision to leave his wife after learning about her financial problems and debts. The suitcase by the door and the testimony of Mark's sister perfectly matched the results of the expertise. The detectives understood that now, with scientific confirmations, they could focus on the essentials to find out what exactly led Chloe to react so aggressively to her husband's intention to leave. The next phase of the investigation was dedicated to examining the couple's private life, financial documents, and personal correspondence. To find an answer to this question, and fully uncover the circumstances that had led to the tragic outcome of that evening, the investigators understood that the conflict in Mark and Chloe's house was a consequence of complex financial circumstances, but they could not limit themselves solely to internal reasons and were obliged to examine absolutely all possible versions. In such cases, there are no simple answers. The investigators had to ensure that they had not overlooked the slightest detail or another potential party involved who might be connected to Chloe's situation and her numerous debts. To this end, the investigative team delved deep into examining financial documentation, bank statements, and Chloe's personal correspondence. The detectives' suspicions were confirmed almost immediately. The woman was indeed in an extremely difficult financial situation. The debts Chloe had accumulated over the past 2 years were not just large. They were gradually becoming uncontrollable. The deeper the detectives delved into her correspondence, the clearer the picture emerged of how desperate Chloe's attempts were to hide her problems from Mark. But among all this information gathered by the investigators, a new, unsettling fact suddenly emerged. In one of Chloe's messengers, correspondence was found with an unknown person demanding repayment of a large sum of money from her. The messages had a clear threatening character and were written in an aggressive tone. The anonymous creditor persistently reminded Chloe of her debt, threatened her with personal problems, and promised serious consequences if the money was not repaid on time. This person not only demanded payment, they clearly alluded to physical consequences for her and her loved ones. Detective Michael Turner and his colleagues were obliged to take these messages seriously. Despite the obvious contradictions in Chloe's statements and the physical evidence found at the crime scene, such threats could not be ignored. The investigators immediately began to identify this person. Thanks to the phone number provided in the correspondence, the police quite quickly traced the presumed sender of these messages. It turned out to be a man named Robert Miller, the owner of a small financial agency specializing in high-interest private loans. The police placed Miller under 24-hour surveillance and, in parallel, investigated his biography, circle of acquaintances, and possible connections to the criminal underworld. The more information the detectives gathered, the more plausible the version appeared that Miller could indeed have a motive to pressure Chloe or her family. He had already been noticed several times for aggressive methods of debt collection and even had several complaints from other clients. However, the investigators needed more compelling reasons than just correspondence and biography to officially question and arrest Miller. The police obtained permission to check his movements on the evening of the tragedy and also requested access to medical records and other important data. It was extremely important for them to determine his exact whereabouts on the day and at the hour when the events in Mark and Chloe's house unfolded. When the detectives received the official results of the check, the version began to rapidly fall apart. It turned out that Robert Miller was not only in a different location that day, he had a 100% alibi, confirmed by official medical documents. Precisely on March 15, the day of the incident, Miller was admitted to the hospital and underwent scheduled surgery at a hospital on the other side of town. The medical records and testimonies of hospital staff completely ruled out his presence at the crime scene in Aspen Woods. This alibi was so convincing and irrefutable that the detectives were forced to officially remove Robert Miller from the list of suspects. The version of a possible external participant was again completely off the table. Thus, the investigation returned to square one. The conflict in the house was exclusively internal, and Chloe's external financial problems only heightened the tension between the spouses. Although the version with the creditor turned out to be a false lead, the police's work was not in vain. Checking Robert Miller made it possible to rule out any doubt that the events of that evening had been initiated by someone from outside. Now, the investigators could fully concentrate on the internal conflict and the investigation of the psychology of the relationship between Chloe and Mark. They already understood that precisely the personal circumstances and mutual distrust had led to the fatal outcome. For Detective Turner and his colleagues, the next step was the careful examination of the couple's personal correspondence and relationships, their hidden conflicts, and possible attempts by Chloe to conceal her problems until the very end. While Chloe's financial correspondence with Robert Miller turned out to be a false lead, it graphically showed the extent of her desperation and the depth of the problems that could have driven her to desperate acts. Now, the detectives were sure of one thing. The answer lay deeper in the couple's relationship, and precisely there they had to continue their search for the truth. The investigators already understood that financial difficulties and long-term lies had become the key elements that brought the events of that evening to a critical point. But to definitively understand what was happening between Mark and Chloe, the detectives had to delve deeper into the woman's past and understand how far back the roots of her behavior went. To this end, the investigation began, step by step, to reconstruct Chloe's psychological profile by speaking with people who had known her long before her encounter with Mark. The police officers started with those who had once been close to Chloe. Over several days, the detectives meticulously examined the list of her past relationships to understand if similar situations had occurred before, or if what happened was absolutely atypical for her. At first glance, it seemed as if Chloe had been a completely normal girl, with typical relationships that, like with many people, ended for various reasons. But when the police began to closely examine the details and speak with her former partners, it turned out that the reality was not so simple. One of Chloe's former partners, a man named Daniel, gave detailed testimony at the police station. His account shed light on certain features of her behavior that became important for understanding how she might react to Mark's decision to leave. Daniel recounted that their relationship had started just as ideally and calmly as Chloe and Mark's. But after some time, he noticed strange contradictions in her words. She constantly hid her purchases and financial difficulties from him, often lied about her expenses, and when he tried to talk to her about it, she reacted sharply, emotionally, and sometimes even aggressively. Daniel also described an episode that particularly troubled the investigators. He recounted that when he decided to end the relationship, Chloe didn't just take it emotionally. She was completely devastated and almost uncontrollable. According to his words, she constantly called, threatened to harm herself, said things that caused concern and fear for her mental state. After that, Daniel was even forced to consult a psychologist because he was frightened by her reaction. Another witness, a former partner of Chloe named James, also made similar statements. He confirmed Daniel's words and spoke of his experience with Chloe, which also began wonderfully but ended similarly, with financial problems, deception, and very emotional scenes during attempts to end the relationship. James noted that after the breakup, Chloe not only tried to win him back, but actively manipulated with emotions, resorting to threats and even blackmail. These were serious signals that showed a specific, persistent behavioral pattern that obviously manifested itself in moments of crisis or loss of control. These testimonies from former partners allowed the investigation to see Chloe not just as a participant in a tragic event, but as a person with deep psychological characteristics who constantly repeated the same mistakes. It became obvious that her behavior on the night of the incident was not sudden or accidental. On the contrary, it fit perfectly into the pattern she had been repeating in her relationships for many years. To confirm the conclusions, the investigators additionally contacted a friend of Chloe's whom she had known since her college days. The friend confirmed that the woman indeed had problems with controlling finances and her emotional state. In difficult situations, Chloe could be extremely unpredictable and impulsive. According to her, Chloe found any attempts to leave her or distance themselves from her very difficult to bear and perceived this as a personal catastrophe. The friend also recounted that Chloe often exploited the pity and sympathy of those around her to avoid responsibility for her mistakes. After analyzing all the collected information, the investigators obtained a clear and rather disturbing psychological portrait of the woman. Now the picture of what happened between Chloe and Mark seemed quite predictable. When Mark learned of the hidden debts and made the decision to leave, for Chloe, this was not just a personal drama, but another repetition of a deeply rooted scenario she had already experienced multiple times. Such a situation triggered not just fear or anger in her, but genuine panic, which could lead to uncontrolled actions. The psychologist's report, who was involved in the investigation, confirmed that for a person with similar behavioral patterns, the departure of a loved one is perceived as something catastrophic and absolutely unacceptable. The psychologist separately noted that the accumulated debts and the need to constantly hide them from her husband only increased the internal tension and could provoke her to impulsive and dangerous actions. Thus, as a result of the careful investigation into Chloe's past, the investigation formed a quite convincing and complete picture of her motivation. Now it became perfectly clear that her reaction to Mark's decision to leave was not accidental, but another episode in a recurring story that had long been unfolding in her life. The investigators no longer doubted that precisely this accumulated internal tension and the inability to cope with the situation had led to the tragic events of that evening. The case took on a completely different light. Not a random emotional outburst, but the finale of a long and agonizing cycle that Chloe had probably experienced many times in her thoughts and actions. Now the detectives faced a new task: to link these psychological details with concrete physical evidence to prove Chloe's ultimate involvement in what happened. When the investigation had gathered enough evidence, Detective Michael Turner invited Chloe and her lawyer for a second official interrogation. It was a crucial meeting, meticulously prepared for over several days. In the small precinct office, and tense silence reigned, broken only by the sound of the activated voice recorder and the soft rustle of papers that the detective carefully spread out on the table before him. Chloe sat opposite the investigator, her lawyer beside her, a quiet, middle-aged man who carefully observed Turner's every move. Chloe appeared tense, her gaze nervously darting around the room as if trying to anticipate what she was about to hear. Turner took his time to begin the conversation, allowing her to feel the gravity of the moment. After a few minutes, he began to speak calmly. The detective's voice was even, without aggression, but one could sense in it the confidence of a man who was in complete control of the situation. He began by reminding Chloe of her original statements about the intrusion of 2 unknown men into the house, meticulously recounting all the details of her story. Chloe confirmed her words, but with much less confidence than before, sometimes glancing at her lawyer as if awaiting his advice. After that, Turner opened a folder in front of him and showed Chloe the photos of the broken living room window. He calmly and methodically explained to her that the forensic technicians had unequivocally determined that the glass had been broken from the inside. He carefully observed her reaction, but Chloe said nothing. She merely looked away slightly and took a deep breath, obviously trying to conceal her tension. The lawyer quickly jotted something in his notebook but said nothing aloud. Next, the detective moved on to the next piece of evidence, Mark's half-packed suitcase standing by the front door. He reminded Chloe that according to her words, they weren't planning to go anywhere with Mark. Why then had her husband packed personal belongings, documents, even his passport in advance? Turner laid the photos of the suitcase's contents on the table and asked if she could explain it. Chloe remained silent again, but her breathing quickened noticeably. She nervously clasped her fingers and closed her eyes for a moment as if collecting her thoughts. Without waiting for an answer, Turner continued, telling her about the testimony of Mark's sister, Emma. He read Chloe an excerpt from her statement, which clearly stated that Mark had called his sister on the evening of March 15, telling her of his intention to leave after learning about Chloe's hidden debts. The detective calmly added that Mark's sister was ready to confirm her testimony in court. Hearing this, Chloe shot a sharp glance at her lawyer, her eyes filled with worry, but the lawyer gestured to her with his hand that she should not say anything for now. Turner did not stop, continuing to present the collected evidence one after another. He told Chloe about the conclusions of the experts who had examined the traces in the house with luminol, about the fingerprints found on the knife belonging to both of them, and about the fact that signs of a struggle were found only between 2 people and no foreign individuals were detected at the crime scene. With each new fact, Chloe became more withdrawn. Her shoulders slumped. She avoided looking at the detective and instead stared intently at the edge of the table in front of her. Detective Turner paused briefly to allow her time to grasp the full extent of the evidence. He stated slowly, emphasizing each word, that the investigation had no doubt that her original story completely contradicted the established facts. Again, a heavy silence hung in the room. The lawyer quietly requested a brief minute for a confidential conversation with his client, which the detective allowed, briefly leaving the office. When he returned, the atmosphere in the room had already changed. Chloe sat upright, her gaze lowered, her face visibly pale. But now there was not panic in her eyes, but a kind of determination, as if she had finally made an important decision for herself. The lawyer gave a signal, and the detective continued recording the interrogation. To Turner's question about what she wanted to add to her words, Chloe unexpectedly began to speak in a calm and even voice. She stated that she was now ready to change her statement and tell what had really happened. With a deep sigh, she communicated that the story about the robbery had been an invention she came up with in a panic to protect herself. Instead, Chloe told a new version, claiming that Mark had started the argument first and suddenly attacked her when she tried to stop him from leaving. She confidently explained that at that moment she was afraid of his reaction and that her actions were only an attempt to protect herself, that she had not intended to harm him, but simply could not control the situation. Turner listened to her story in silence, meticulously noting every word. Now Chloe's version had fundamentally changed, and although her statement was practically an admission of her involvement in the tragic events, she insisted that she had acted solely in self-defense. At the end of her narrative, the detective calmly switched off the dictaphone, declaring the interrogation concluded. Chloe and her lawyer left the office, leaving the investigators with a new turn in the case. Now the detectives faced a completely new task: to verify the self-defense version presented by Chloe and determine whether it could correspond to the truth, or if it was the last attempt to avoid a full confession of guilt. After Chloe presented a new version of events, claiming she had acted solely in self-defense, the detectives had to turn to the experts again. Now, the investigators needed to find a clear and scientifically sound answer to the most important question of this investigative phase. Could the events in the house actually be interpreted as self-defense? Or was this another attempt by Chloe to evade responsibility? To this end, an additional forensic medical examination was ordered, which was to carefully examine and compare the nature of the injuries sustained by both participants in the conflict. The experts analyzed every wound, every scratch, and every injury in detail and thoroughly to determine the exact picture of what happened. It was precisely this analysis that was to finally dot all the I's. When the results of the forensic medical examination landed on Detective Michael Turner's desk, it became clear that the investigation now held conclusive and irrefutable evidence that completely undermined Chloe's new story. The expert's report meticulously described the nature of the injuries found on Mark and Chloe. According to the report, Mark sustained numerous defensive wounds. Such injuries, the experts stated, occur only in one case: when a person tries to protect themselves by shielding an attack with their hands and forearms. The document stated that all of Mark's injuries were concentrated on the backs of his hands and forearms, clearly indicating that he had actively tried to defend himself against another person's aggression. In contrast, the injuries found on Chloe looked quite different. The forensic experts pointed out that her cuts were exclusively superficial and clean, and arranged in such a way that they could have been self-inflicted. The experts even noted that the arrangement and shape of the injuries on her hands did not correspond to those usually sustained when attempting to defend oneself. In other words, Chloe's injuries were more of a staging, an attempt to create the appearance of a struggle, and not its actual result. The report specifically highlighted the complete absence of any traces or trauma on Chloe's body that could indicate active resistance or self-defense. No bruises, abrasions, or contusions were found on her body, which are almost always present in people attempting to protect themselves in a situation of physical confrontation. As a result of the analysis, the forensic experts came to the unequivocal conclusion: the nature and arrangement of Chloe's injuries completely contradicted her new version of self-defense. For the detectives, this report became the strongest piece of evidence throughout the entire investigation. Now they possessed irrefutable scientific proof that clearly indicated who the aggressor was that evening and who was trying to protect themselves. The forensic technician's report literally disproved all of Chloe's claims, from the first version about the intrusion of strangers to the new version about the allegedly forced defense against an attack by her husband. When Detective Turner informed Chloe's lawyer of these findings, the suspect's defense strategy practically collapsed before his eyes. The lawyer obviously understood the gravity of the situation and made no further comments or objections to the expert's conclusions. Chloe also remained silent, avoiding eye contact with the investigators, as if she understood that she now had nothing more to say. Thus, the forensic medical examination definitively confirmed the detective's suspicion that Chloe was not only involved in the conflict, but that she was precisely the one who initiated the attack and undertook active aggressive actions against her husband. All previously collected evidence perfectly aligned with the new report, forming a coherent picture of what had happened. The investigators gained a clear understanding that the self-defense version was another attempt by Chloe to evade responsibility for the committed act. Now the detectives had only one task left: to officially record this fact and hand over all the evidence to the prosecutor for the official indictment. With this report in hand, The investigators were confident that the question of Chloe's guilt was no longer in doubt, and it only remained for them to prepare the final documents so that the court could begin examining the case. After the final evidence had been carefully reviewed and documented, the case reached a point where further investigation became futile. The investigators and the prosecution already had an exhaustive collection of evidence confirming that Chloe was not only a participant in the conflict, but also its main instigator. At this moment, the prosecution officially charged her. Second-degree murder, committed intentionally but without premeditation. Chloe received this news without apparent surprise. On the advice of her lawyer, she pleaded not guilty and decided to stick to the version that her actions were exclusively a necessary measure of protection against Mark's aggression. Her position did not change even after she was presented with numerous expert opinions, witness statements, and investigation reports. Chloe and her lawyer continued to insist that she had not planned to commit unlawful acts, and everything that happened was the result of a chain of tragic circumstances. The prosecutor, familiar with all the nuances of the case, was confident in his position. He understood that the evidence collected spoke much more convincingly than any words. That is precisely why he did not try to additionally convince Chloe of the untenability of her defense, but simply handed the materials over to the court, where the final battle of arguments would now take place. The investigators had already completed their part of the work by this point. For them, the case was fully and quite unambiguously clarified. Their task was merely to prepare all the documents and hand over the collected materials to the prosecutor. Now it was up to the lawyers of both sides to present their versions of events to the jury. Public interest in this case increased sharply because from the outside it looked completely different. For many acquaintances and neighbors, Mark and Chloe were an ideal couple, an exemplary family, envied and admired. Now all of that was destroyed in one fell swoop, and people found it difficult to believe the dark and complex circumstances hidden within the walls of their home. The trial promised to be long and difficult. Both sides had sufficient reasons to insist on their versions of events, and now the prosecution's task was to convince the jury of the veracity of the evidence obtained during the investigation. Chloe's lawyers, on the other hand, intended to portray her as a victim of circumstances, as a person who had found herself in a hopeless situation and was forced to act to protect herself. Precisely here, in the courtroom, all the details that the investigators had so meticulously collected were to be revealed. Here, witnesses, experts, and people who knew this couple well enough to confirm or refute certain statements would also be questioned. Now the outcome of the case depended not only on the evidence but also on how this evidence would be presented and perceived by the jury. For Chloe, this was the last opportunity to prove that her actions had a justification, and for the prosecution, the chance to show that all the defense's arguments were merely an attempt to evade responsibility. The final word belonged to the court, and only there would Chloe's ultimate fate be decided. In court, the prosecutor presented the jury with a step-by-step, detailed and accurate reconstruction of the events of that evening, based solely on evidence and expert testimonies. For the first time, the picture of what happened became absolutely clear, forming a unified, convincing narrative in which there was no room for chance or doubt. According to the prosecution's version, the sequence of events began with Mark's phone call to his sister at 19:30. In this brief dialogue, he informed her that he had discovered Chloe's hidden financial problems and was firmly resolved to leave her forever. Mark's sister confirmed this in her testimony, describing his voice as dejected but resolute. This call was precisely the starting point of the ensuing conflict. Approximately at 20:10, directly after the conversation, Mark began packing his belongings into the suitcase. The prosecutor pointed out that this fact was confirmed by the suitcase itself, found by the police in the hallway by the door, containing Mark's personal belongings, passport, and bank cards. When Chloe understood that her husband was actually going to leave, a serious argument erupted between them, which began in the living room and quickly escalated. The traces revealed by the forensic technicians using luminol showed that the argument was initially emotional. However, the situation soon got out of control and escalated into a physical altercation. According to the records, the dispute quickly moved to the kitchen, where the situation drastically worsened. It was there that Chloe most likely took the kitchen knife, which experts later found under the sofa in the living room bearing the fingerprints of both spouses. The prosecutor described in detail how Mark tried to avoid further confrontation and retreated upstairs to the bedroom. Experts confirmed that he had repeatedly tried to protect himself from the attack. Numerous defensive wounds were found on his hands and forearms, typical of a person shielding themselves from knife stabs. In the bedroom on the second floor, the conflict reached its peak. According to the conclusions of the forensic medical examination, the altercation did not last long, but it was very intense. After that, Chloe remained in a state of shock for some time and was inactive. Only after some time did she begin to take active steps to cover up the true picture of what had happened. The prosecution stated that it was precisely during this time that Chloe decided to stage the version of an intrusion and attack by unknown individuals. She smashed the window in the living room from the inside to create the illusion of a break-in, and then inflicted cuts on herself using a blade found in the bathroom. The forensic medical examination confirmed that her injuries were superficial and clearly staged. This sequence was meticulously reconstructed by the prosecutor and corroborated by a multitude of evidence. The call to the sister, the packed suitcase, the expert reports, the witness testimonies, and the nature of the injuries sustained by both parties in the conflict. The prosecutor emphasized that Chloe's actions could not be considered accidental or spontaneous self-defense. On the contrary, all facts indicated that she was precisely the initiator of the conflict and had deliberately committed acts against Mark, after which she attempted to cover it up. This carefully constructed and evidence-backed reconstruction of events became the foundation of the prosecution's case and the starting point of the trial. Now, the jury had to decide Chloe's fate, relying solely on the facts and the logic of the events of that tragic evening. The trial began in May 2024 and immediately attracted significant public attention. During the proceedings, the defense persistently claimed Chloe had acted purely in self-defense, portraying her as a victim of circumstances. The prosecution, however, consistently refuted this version by presenting strict and irrefutable physical evidence, expert opinions, the nature of the injuries, witness testimonies, and details of the staged robbery. After several days of court hearings, the jury retired to deliberate. They discussed the case at length and meticulously, examining every detail. After hours of waiting, their final verdict was announced. Chloe was found guilty of second-degree murder. The judge announced the sentence: life imprisonment with the possibility of parole only after 17 years. Now Chloe's future fate depended entirely on how she would spend this time and whether she could convince the parole board in the future that she deserved a chance to return to society. After the judge delivered his verdict, the story of Mark and Chloe seemed to have reached its logical conclusion. The house in the quiet suburb of Aspen Woods, once a symbol of an ideal life and a successful young family, was soon put up for sale. The new owners hastened to carry out renovations to erase any memories of the tragic events that had transpired within its walls. Chloe is currently serving the sentence imposed by the court in a correctional facility in Alberta. Her life has radically changed, and now her entire existence is reduced to the routine of prison life. Meanwhile, the couple's neighbors and acquaintances gradually return to their usual lives, trying to remember this story as little as possible. But despite the final verdict, some details remained unanswered. No one will ever know exactly what words passed between them in those last 4 hours, and what precisely was the final straw after which events became irreversible. These details will remain hidden forever, known only to one person, the one who now silently guards them behind bars.